Senator Lyons.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. And may I say at the outset that I am a very proud member of United Voice, and prior to coming into the Senate, prior to being a proud senator for the state of Western Australia, I was an elected official of that union, both at a state level and in the latter part of my career with United Voice as a national official. And I can assure the Senate that I took my responsibilities as an elected official very, very seriously, and I can vouch for many members of trade unions who take on elected positions that they take their responsibilities very seriously. Let me also be very clear, because you won't hear it from those opposite, and I want to make this at the very beginning of my comments today, is that make no mistake, the Labor Party has no tolerance for corruption by union officials or officers of employer bodies. And we've said that over and over again. And not only have we said it, when in government we demonstrated that we were very serious to live up to that commitment. And when we had the Senate inquiries around this bill before it was amended, all of the union officials who appeared before us made that same statement during the inquiries. And Labor supports tough penalties for those that break the law. Not only do we support it, but we have demonstrated it. And we support and have demonstrated that appropriate regulation for registered organisations is a good thing and a proper thing, including a properly empowered regulator and consequences for those who do not follow the rules. Labor in government and in opposition continues to be committed to ensuring financial accountability by unions and employer organisation. And, Mr Deputy President, that's why, when we were in government in 2012, we put forward laws to toughen the existing financial transparency and disclosures by registered organisations. So what are those laws about? Because you won't hear it from that chaotic, dysfunctional Abbott government opposite. You'll just hear spin and mistruths. So currently, under Labor's legislation, the regulation of trade unions in Australia has never been stronger. Accountability has never been higher. The powers of the Fair Work Commission to investigate and prosecute for breaches have never been broader. And of course, as we heard from Senator Cameron this morning, Labor tripled the penalties, which means they've never been tougher. And I have to say, before I became a senator, when I worked as an elected official for United Voice, these laws impacted on United Voice, and we had to get ourselves trained, had to change the way we did a whole range of things in order to comply with these laws. So I have direct, first-hand experience, unlike anyone over there on the government side, that these laws work. They put in place absolute transparency, and if that's not demonstrated, then there are tougher laws. I lived under this legislation. I have direct experience of how tough it is. Now, we hear those opposite talk about the HSU matters. Let me say what the Act already does. Registered organisations already prohibit money from being used to favour particular candidates in internal elections or campaigns. That's been a law for a very, very long time, but of course you won't hear that from the government because it wants to put spin around it. Whenever the government's in trouble in this place, they come in here during question time, and what do we hear with their Dorothy Dixes? We hear demonising of trade unions because they hate the way trade unions can talk to their members, can listen to their members' concerns about the harsh, cruel Abbott government. They hate that. So anything the Abbott government can do to demonise trade unions, to make life tough for trade unions, even at the expense of their business mates, they will do. Make no mistake, that's all spin on the other side. So we have in the Act a law which says you cannot use members' money from being used to favour particular candidates in internal elections or campaigns. The Registered Organisations Act already allows for criminal proceedings being initiated where funds are stolen or are obtained by fraud. The Registered Organisations Act already ensures the Fair Work Commission can share information with the police as appropriate. And the Registered Organisations Act already provides for statutory civil penalties where a party knowingly or recklessly contravenes an order or direction made by the Federal Court or the Fair Work Commission under the Registered Organisations Act or the Fair Work Act. So those laws are already, those penalties are already there, that toughness is already there, but of course you won't hear that from the Abbott government because this bill before the Senate today is not about toughness and transparency. It's about making life tougher for trade unions, and in doing that, because with their right-wing Tea Party ideology, they've also hooked in their business mates. And their business mates are not happy either. So, under the Fair Work Act, officers of registered organisations already have fiduciary duties akin to those for directors under the Corporations Law. We already have that. So make no mistake, when government senators try and stand in this place today and say somehow we don't, we do. These are the facts. Registered organisations, the Act already requires officers to disclose their personal interests. The Act already asks officers to disclose when payments are made to related parties. And the Act already requires officers to exercise care and diligence, to act with good faith and not improperly use their position for political advantage. So it is not surprising, therefore, Mr Deputy President, that Labor senators should question the motives of the Abbott government and their reasons for introducing these reforms before the Senate today. Because this bill before the Senate today, which Labor will oppose, and sensible senators will also oppose, because it just goes too far. And what it demonstrates is the ideology of the Abbott government, its right-wing Tea Party agenda. And this bill also highlights the chaotic and divisive nature of the government, and it shows that they're not prepared to trust anyone. It just furthers the mistrust that community members have in the government, and the dysfunction of the government is well and truly on display. Because the Abbott government has demonstrated time and time again that it doesn't like trade unions. And it doesn't much like Australian workers, whether it's demonising shipbuilders claiming, as the government did prior to Christmas, that you wouldn't trust them to build a canoe. What a disgraceful statement that was, and deservedly that minister rightfully has been thrown onto the backbench. Fancy pretending to be a government who supports Australian workers and making that claim, which will remain on the Hansard forever and a day in this place, saying to those shipbuilders, I wouldn't trust you to build a canoe. No wonder the Abbott government's popularity and its Prime Minister are dropping in the polls when they can so flippantly make that type of comment. The government's agenda is to make life harder for workers and their representatives in whatever way they can, and a demonstration of that is to point to this unnecessary bill which Labor will not support. We have set, when in government, we set very, very high benchmarks for trade unions and registered organisations. And let me just talk for a moment about the registered organisations, because if you just listened to the Abbott government, you'd think it was all about unions. You will not hear government senators talk very often about employer organisations. You will just hear them refer and try and demonise trade unions in this country. And when they talk about ordinary Australians, it's almost as if they're drawing this distinction between ordinary Australians who are members of trade unions and then this other group of ordinary Australians who look upon trade unions as somehow evil or with horns growing out of their head. That's the sort of message you will get from the Abbott government. But let me talk about who it is the government is seeking to demonise, because trade unions and employer groups both rely on volunteers. And during the Senate inquiry, we heard evidence from employer groups and trade unions about their volunteers. And what those two organisations have in common, trade unions and employers, is that without volunteers, those organisations simply will cease to exist. When I look at United Voice, my trade union, and it's not much different from all of the other trade unions in Australia in terms of the way it's been set up, is the majority, in fact most of the office bearers within United Voice and other unions are volunteers. But you won't hear that from those opposite. And we heard evidence from employer groups, and I will certainly stand corrected on the record. I think it was AIG who told us they rely too on vast numbers of volunteers. Possibly 80% of their people who run that organisation on behalf of small businesses in this country are volunteers. So this legislation that's before us today seeks to impose great barriers on volunteers. And we heard employers group during the Senate inquiry tell us it would be very hard for them to attract volunteers when they would have to sit down and go through all of the requirements that volunteers had to undertake. Now, of course, I'm not stepping back from the tough legislation that Labor put in place, but this legislation the Abbott government has put in place that seeks to attack trade unions at the expense of their business mates will impose much tougher penalties and much greater responsibility in terms of disclosing, transparency and so on. So when you think of, as I go around the state of Western Australia and I see that there are chambers of commerce in our small country towns and so on, which are usually consisted of 1 or 2 or 3 volunteers, make no mistake, the Abbott government is seeking to penalise those small country employer associations by imposing much greater red tape, much greater red tape. And of course, you will hear from the National Party senators today that that's a good thing. So I say to those out in the bush, those associations, the employer associations in the small rural towns in Western Australia, it's the National Party, who actually doesn't represent the bush anymore, who's imposed this much greater level of responsibility on your organisation. It's those people. And what we know about volunteers in our community, whether they're in the metro area or the country, is they usually volunteer to do other things. So they might be volunteering to be an official, take up an official position on a trade union or their local employer association. Those people will be active in the playgroups, in their football clubs, in their netball clubs, in a whole range of other areas. These are the ordinary Australians that the Abbott government is seeking to impose much greater responsibility onto. And this morning in this place, on another bill, I heard Senator Brandis say that the Abbott government was absolutely determined to reduce red tape, green tape, and there's a new colour of tape that we heard from Senator Brandis today, and that's beige tape. and perhaps Senator Cormann might tell us later on what beige tape is, but that's been added to the list. I'm not sure who beige tape strangles, but no doubt we will hear that from the government. There's a new colour of tape added. And what he said, what Senator Brandis said, is that Australian businesses yearn to be free of that red, green and beige tape. But the Abbott government, in pursuing this harsh, overburdensome legislation, is imposing greater red, green and beige. Well, perhaps it's just red and beige. I think I understand what green is. So it's attempting to impose red and beige tape on employer organisations. And we heard from another government senator that he said that Australian businesses, employer organisations and unions didn't want to be dragged into the mud. And yet, what do we see from the Abbott government when it's in trouble, when its popularity rate is at the lowest level in our history? Well, every day in this place, during question time with their Dorothy Dixes, we see demonising, dragging trade unions into the mud. We get the backbenchers asking Senator Abetz a question which seeks to drag a trade union into the mud. So just two examples, two very small examples, where of course you cannot trust the Abbott government on anything it says. The mistrust the Australian people have of the Abbott government is at an all-time high. And ordinary Australians who are members of trade unions also mistrust the government. And I can assure the Abbott government that the nurses, the cleaners, the teachers, the early childhood educators, the hospitality workers, the metal workers, the construction workers, ordinary Australians who turn up to vote, who volunteer for their trade union in an elected capacity, don't support this legislation. And in fact, Labor's legislation is still being bedded down. No review of that legislation, no consultation. And interestingly, in the time that this bill was put forward, and by the time it finally got to this chamber to be debated, we had that great proclamation from Prime Minister Abbott Monday week ago. "I'm going to listen," he said. "I'm going to listen." Well, if he was really listening, he would have gone back, looked at this Fair Work Registered Orgs Amendment Bill, looked at the evidence that we heard in our Senate inquiries and said, "Oh, hang on a bit, this is not supported by my employer mates, and it's not supported by trade unions." Nobody gave evidence that they supported this current bill that's before us. Nobody. So, just as Labor has said, that is just weasel words from the Prime Minister. He has no intention of listening. Because if he was really listening, this bill would be taken back to the drawing board. In fact, if he was truly going to live up to his words that he was listening, then this bill would be put on the scrap heap. And Monday must be the day the Prime Minister makes new proclamations, because this Monday he promised good government. Now, I'm not quite sure when good government is going to start. He didn't give a time, so maybe it was Tuesday, but we're yet to see good government in this place. There's no good government. And quite frankly, what was he doing from September until this Monday? Because we haven't seen good government by his very own admission. So good government wouldn't impose this ridiculous right-wing Tea Party anti-union legislation. It would not, because we have tough penalties in place. We have a judicial system which can prosecute people who are alleged to have undertaken criminal activity, which has a range of actions, and that's actually what has occurred in this place. So the government is not listening, the Prime Minister's not listening, and I think he's on his last legs. Mr Turnbull is still sniffing around, as is Ms Bishop. We haven't yet seen good government in this place, and this bill will not be supported by Labor. Thank you, Mr Deputy President.